I get it. I understand. This is a huge accusation to make against the government, and you may not be convinced. You may need more evidence. Nazism seemed to many just an extreme version of what Germans had always believed or taken for granted. It was nationalistic, respectful of the armed forces, socially conservative, disdainful of laziness, hostile to eccentric or incomprehensive ideas that came from cities, disapproving of homosexuals and other unconventional human types, and avid to achieve greatness for Germany. They welcomed parts of the Nazi political and social smorgasbord and told themselves the rest was less important or wasn't meant seriously. By using dog whistles and drip feeding, the government has turned society away from experts and others educated in Nazi history, effectively disempowering knowledge in favour of gut feeling. Michael Gove famously opined, "I think the people of this country have had enough of experts." Some people will apparently be put off applying to our elite institutions by the prospect of taking on a debt of this size, which, as far as I'm concerned, is all to the good. Nazi criminal Hermann Goering was a little more blunt. Education is dangerous. Every educated person is a future enemy. Education allows people to see through the dog whistles and misinformation that Nazism needs to survive and thrive. Few of us learn about German politics at school. Most of us heard about the Holocaust, but that's not where it began. So they don't see it beginning in our own country because there's nothing to relate it to. Briefly though, Hitler didn't start the party. He took over, alienating many of the more moderate party members along the way. Boris did much the same, even going so far as to kick the then father of the house, Kenneth Clarke, out of the Tory party altogether, along with 20 other mainly senior Tories. Hitler, once in the German parliament, hadn't enough seats, so he manoeuvred the German people into a series of elections until he got his majority, albeit with support from some smaller parties. Boris did exactly the same, ensuring that every Tory candidate pledged to support no-deal Brexit, if that became necessary. How else could he hope to get out of the European Convention? Once he had his majority, Hitler created the Enabling Act, granting him the right to make decisions without referring to other elected officials for 4 years. In truth, these dictatorship rights lasted until his death, well over a decade later. Boris has used his majority to grant his own Enabling Act, meaning he doesn't need to consult Parliament for various issues covering a huge amount of policy. Boris has since used his majority to extend his Enabling Act, and there's nothing to stop him doing so again. Hitler, once in power, disenfranchised huge swathes of his political opponents, thus quashing all political opposition. Boris is working on changing electoral boundaries to favour Conservative candidates and is also preparing plans to disenfranchise poorer people who may not drive and who can't afford passports with his voter ID scheme. Hitler repeatedly broke international agreements. Boris has done the same. He did this when he denied abandoned refugee children with relatives here in UK access to the country, leaving them to fend for themselves in the Calais camps, where they risk slavery and a range of exploitation by people traffickers, not to mention starvation. He promised the EU that he'd enshrine workers' rights under the Brexit deal and then relegated it to aspiration only by moving it from the legally binding section of the document to the non-binding but desirable part. That's why the rest of Parliament objected to the deal, because of working people's rights. Hitler expelled foreigners. Boris is doing exactly the same, far more ruthlessly than Theresa May's hostile environment ever did.
A generation of Brits who came here as children have been facing the threat of deportation from the UK. So what? They went to British schools, they worked British jobs, they built British lives. But recently, some were denied healthcare, lost jobs, were detained and faced being thrown out of their country. They are the Windrush generations. Between 1948 through to the late 60s, more than 500,000 people came to the UK from the Caribbean. It was the first wave of Commonwealth immigration. They were invited over by the British government to work in public services and help rebuild the country after the Second World War.
Hitler's original plan was to move all Jews to Madagascar. Boris and Patel want to use Ascension Island in the mid-Atlantic for similar purposes. When he no longer saw the need for the German parliament, Hitler just closed it down. When Boris couldn't get his own way, he illegally attempted to prorogue Parliament for months, just as the original Brexit deadline was coming up, making it impossible for elected representatives to scrutinise, amend or vote on the final bill.
No justification for taking action with such an extreme effect has been put before the court. The only evidence of why it was taken is the memorandum from Nicky da Costa of 15th August. This explains why holding the Queen's speech to open a new session of Parliament on the 14th of October would be desirable. It does not explain why it was necessary to bring parliamentary business to a halt for 5 weeks before that, when the normal period necessary to prepare for a Queen's speech is 4 to 6 days.
In both cases, these are the actions of a leader transforming himself into a dictator. What type of dictator depends upon their attitude to human rights. The best way to take control over a people and control them utterly is to take a little of their freedom at a time, to erode rights by 1,000 tiny, almost imperceptible reductions. In this way, the people will not see those rights and freedoms being removed until past the point at which these changes cannot be reversed. Adolf Hitler. Let's go through what we know so far. Article 1. Respect the Convention. Article 1 says all EU member states must respect the Convention and include it in domestic law. That's why we have the Human Rights Act. And as we've already seen, successive Tory governments have sought to scrap it for years. Article 2, the right to life. This is about more than the death penalty, although that's part of it. The first duty of any government is to protect its citizens, and Article 2 covers this as well. It means making provision for people to be able to get the things essential to life, like food and shelter. And also, Article 2 prohibits governments from placing people's lives in unnecessary danger, despite Boris's comments on letting the bodies pile up.
But even more worrying, the home's owner has told Sky News he's been asked to take in patients from hospitals who are actively suffering from COVID-19.
I know that absolutely everybody said no, and there would be a very good reason for that. That would be tantamount to importing death into care homes.
The Nazis deliberately euthanized, that's killed, those who weren't productive. The people they described as useless eaters. I made a video when the pandemic first began about how government policy is achieving the same result by getting rid of those who were on benefits first. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can view that video by clicking the little symbol above. Article 3. Freedom from torture and inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Jacob Rees-Mogg is a landlord, as are many Conservative MPs. He voted against legislation that would force landlords to ensure that rented accommodation was fit for human occupation. That's Article 3 stuff. Article 4. Freedom from slavery. During World War II, the Germans and the Japanese operated a no work, no food policy in their concentration and POW camps. Basically, if you didn't work, you didn't eat. That's slavery in anyone's language. Most Brits would be appalled at such a policy. Our modern government still operates workfare, whereby unemployed people who may have paid into the system through their national insurance contributions for years, are forced to work for businesses or lose their benefits and the ability to buy food for up to 6 weeks on the first offence, and even longer subsequently. This amounts to our own no work, no food policy. Article 5, the right to liberty and security. Personally, I have no issue with lockdown in respect of the COVID pandemic. What does concern me is the arbitrary way in which the government, without consultation, has variously imposed and reinstated it simply on a whim, without, as we now know, any reference to the advice of epidemiologists or virologists. This blasé disregard for civil liberties, however justified it may be during COVID, doesn't bode well for the future. Even worse, the government has chosen to ban political rallies because of COVID, but still allows large sporting events. Unsurprising, since the gambling businesses support the party and individual MPs. My own Tory MP, Mark Jenkinson, has just appeared in the press, having accepted a free ticket to a box at Ascot worth £1,400 from the Betting and Gaming Council before writing an article in support of gambling for Conservative Home. It seems obvious that the ban on political gathering is no more than an attempt to prevent political opponents from organising effectively. It's Boris's version of the Nazi trick of machine gunning German citizens who demonstrated against them. Of course, British people wouldn't accept the killing of political opponents. Not yet, anyway.
The EDL became synonymous with racism and Islamophobia. Its members connected to hate crimes and mosque bombings. It was tempting to brush the EDL aside as racist thugs set on promoting fear. But so many ordinary citizens were responding to their message.
Article 6, the right to a fair trial, with reporting restrictions to protect fairness in this or related trials. We've already covered this in part with earlier things like Theresa May wanting to deport people merely suspected of crime. But it goes further. Not only have the Tories reduced access to legal aid, they're overhauling the entire court system from the top down in a bid to consolidate their own power. Tory Attorney General Suella Braverman wrote an article promising to disempower judges and the courts. She wrote, "Parliament's legitimacy is unrivalled and the reason why we must take back control, not just from the EU, but from the judiciary." Given that Parliament had by then already issued Boris's Enabling Act, she might have worded it a bit more accurately. Boris's legitimacy is unrivalled, and the reason why we must take back control, not just from the EU, but from the judiciary. Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life, home and correspondence. This includes the storage and misuse of personal data. Cambridge Analytica and Dominic Cummings are alleged to have been in breach of this, but were never brought to trial. It's interesting to note that the government's original track and trace app was developed by Cummings' friends firm. Unjustified mass and individual surveillance are also covered by this article. And let's not forget the abandoned kids in Calais. That's an Article 8 issue too. So I get it. The European Convention really has thwarted Conservative intentions for years. And a bloody good thing too. Article 9. the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Need I say more? Article 10. The right to freedom of expression. In UK we say freedom of speech. Despite banging on about their love for freedom of speech, the Tories and their supporters tend to advocate, even by dog whistle, very strict penalties for disagreeing with them. The right to freedom of assembly and association. As we noted earlier, the government is doing all it can to ban political rallies just as the Nazis did. Article 13, the right to an effective remedy such as fair compensation or remedy where wronged. The Tory assault on legal aid provision almost guarantees that only the wealthy can afford to seek legal remedy in the courts. Then we have Article 2 of the first protocol, the right to education. We've already noted Gove's attitude to education for all but the elite, but it gets worse. The Erasmus scheme is a European Union initiative to pay the fees of students studying abroad and to provide subsistence while they do so. The UK had the chance to remain part of this fantastic educational opportunity, but the government voted to opt out. Even Attorney General Suella Braverman, remember her? Herself a former beneficiary of Erasmus, voted against it. The UK has created a watered-down version, the Turing scheme, but tuition fees won't be paid. Only a modest subsistence grant, and it's only available to the lowest income families, many of whom wouldn't be able to afford the tuition fees anyway. Just like the Nazis, only basic education is available to the masses in practice. Higher education, the really dangerous stuff, as Goering put it, is reserved for the elite. These are all supported by Article 14, which says that all the rights in the Convention apply to all people without discrimination. Like people with watermelon smiles who go around looking like letterboxes. Hey, Boris.
Mr. Speaker, wherever there is racism, it falls on all of us to face it down and to call it out. And it is shameful that it took until last night for the Prime Minister to meet with the main social media companies and finally wake up to the fact that those who publish and promote vile, racist online abuse need to be faced down and sanctioned. So, can the Prime Minister tell us what sanctions he thinks would be appropriate for someone who publishes racist content? And it is shocking even to have to say this out loud. Describing Africans as flag-waving pickaninnies with watermelon smiles.
Shameful. So what's to be done? Well, it's not too late. Even now, we can pull the country back from the brink. We don't even need a general election. MPs like being MPs, and they dislike anything that might lose them an election. If we can mobilise enough people to call the Tories out on their human rights abuses and to show that we know what's happening, the Parliamentary Party will turn against Boris, Gove, Patel, Rees-Mogg and the rest to save their own political skins. The leader will change, the cabinet will change, and the party will begin the long walk back to politics as usual. That's not ideal, they're still Tories, but at least it's not fascism. It's not Nazism. So please, share this information as widely as you can. Not everyone will take the time to watch this collection of videos, I know that, but there are other ways to get the information out there. Obviously, I'd prefer to see shares of my work across social media, but if that's not the most effective way for you and your colleagues, then do something else, whatever works. I'll close with an anonymous quote from a German citizen who'd just been taken by American forces to view the local concentration camp. Suddenly it all comes down all at once. You see what you are, what you've done, or more accurately, what you haven't done. For that was all that was required of most of us, that we do nothing. You remember the occasions in which maybe if you'd stood, others would have stood too. You remember everything, and your heart breaks. Too late. You are compromised beyond repair. Lest we forget.